Hello students, welcome once again to another of our video presentations of Humanities 232. I'm your instructor, Dr. Barry Graham. Just a quick mention that this is an unedited video, and so just apologize in advance for any stammering or anything that might go on in the presentation that normally would have been edited out. We're going to continue today with Chapter 15, The Baroque World, as usual, Culture and Values, 8th edition, in our textbook. As we look at this, we want to make note of this world map, the overseas possessions at the end of the 17th century, that being the end of the 1600s. We are, once again, looking at the Baroque period. The Baroque period is basically 1600 through 1750 in the Common Era here. And you can see since the early journeys of Columbus and Magellan and so many of the other early explorers from European lands primarily, that the world is drastically changing. And that will need to be taken into account as we look at this new era, the Baroque era, and its characteristics. Changes in religion. We want to look here at a structure that obviously still stands today. This is in Vatican City. This is in St. Peter's there in Italy. In Rome, but specifically more a part of Vatican City, which actually, as we've mentioned earlier, is a part of its own country. In a day and age before mass media, when someone needed to project a good message or any type of message to a large audience, this was unparalleled up to this time. When the Pope could make a speech from this particular area, you had a colonnade, as I'm indicating here with my mouse pointer, that could hold up to 250,000 people. So an audience with the Pope here could contain a lot of people, and there was a lot of damage control that was being done by the Catholic Church at this time because of some of the abuses that had been exposed by the reformers. And we call this the Counter-Reformation. This was the Catholic Church's response to what the Reformation leaders were doing in pointing out the abuses of the Catholic Church. Now, as you may or may not know, when the Catholic Church draws its leaders together to discuss matters such as this, it's called a council, and they have it in a particular city, and that's usually how it's named. And so one of the cities is Trent, in which there have been a number of historic councils. This particular one starts in 1545 and goes all the way until 1563. You can tell that these are not short meetings. These meetings would go on for literally decades because it took a lot of time to get people together and to make these decisions, and it was slowed by the lack of technology at this time. So the Roman Church decided to redefine their doctrines, to reaffirm the basic beliefs, which the required beliefs of the Catholic Church, which of course they call dogmas. And so there was the assertion of a need for discipline, but also for education. There were new artistic demands and keyed to a specific purpose. As you recall, at this time, one of the primary ways to educate people with no mass media was with the art. And so this takes a huge role in what the Catholic Church is trying to do here with the Counter-Reformation. Some of the monks and leaders at this time were of the Society of Jesus, sometimes called the Jesuits. You've probably heard of the Jesuits. There are Jesuit schools even around today. The leader was Ignatius Loyola. Loyola College is named for him. And these were the missionaries that strove for educational improvement. Now, one thing that's not mentioned in your textbooks here is the fact that this was a very brutal movement. Loyola butchered, mass murdered many, many Protestants and people who they didn't feel like took part in the Catholic Church there. So this was not just a calm, benign missionary or educational movement. Make no mistake about it, this was a different time when engaging in these kinds of brutal tactics was considered acceptable by some. In the 17th century, as we enter the fully into the Baroque period, if we want to characterize this particular artistic style, whether we're talking about visual art, music, etc., it's decentralized. And in this we mean that many, many nations are taking part, and there's not one central country or people that are calling the shots, so to speak. This is art for the middle class. The middle class, as you recall, being something fairly new in culture. You had no middle class up until about the time of the Renaissance. Middle class was made possible by the birth of capitalism, which of course we still use as our economic system today. If we want to talk about the characteristics of the art, it's rich, it's ornate, it's elaborate, it's fanciful, and when you see and hear the music of this particular period, I think you'll see where we're going at here. It's very emotional. The music of the previous era, much more intellectual. This had much more of an appeal to the emotions, and art tends to go back and forth like a pendulum between those two extremes of intellectualism and emotionalism. There's a psychological exploration, a real prodding or exploration of people's minds and feelings and their psychological state, and you would expect that with an emotional appeal. Not to mention, new technologies make possible new techniques, and the idea of extolling the virtuosity of the artist. This is more of a new thing. Rather than the artist just be considered as a hired worker, we're beginning to see the artist recognized for their great skill, or what we might call virtuosity here. We want to look at paintings first. Again, much of this is centered around Rome because of the support of the Catholic Church, and much of this, the first artist we want to look at is Caravaggio. He was known for his dramatic naturalism, his realism. His art tended to be very brutal, very pessimistic. Once again, as we've noted earlier, very emotional, very psychological, getting into the mind of the artist and also the people that he's depicting in the particular artwork. One technique that was pioneered during this time is called chiaroscuro. Believe it or not, it's an art technique and even a movie technique that's used even to this day. If you're familiar with the artist Frank Miller, who started out in the comic books doing Batman years ago and later doing graphic novels, he ended up participating and even directing such movies as The 300 and Sin City. If you notice in his works, there's a real use of color to define shapes, and there's kind of a dark edge to it. Some of the other movie makers have copied that, such as you can see even in more recent movies, such as Batman versus Superman and Justice League and some of those types of movies. And they've been influenced very much by Frank Miller because he got his start in the comics. Well, he got his inspiration from these artists hundreds of years ago. We see this in Caravaggio's paintings such as The Calling of St. Matthew, The Martyrdom of St. Matthew. We also see it in Gentileschi's paintings as well. Notice that there's both a man and a woman involved here. So we're beginning to see some participation by the women as well. We've mentioned these two works here, The Calling of St. Matthew and also The Martyrdom of St. Matthew. This is martyrdom, of course, means somebody dying for their faith. And in both of these works, we'll just kind of go back and forth. Notice the light coming through the window here and how that fixates or draws your attention to the faces of the individuals here as Matthew is being called. Students are fond of pointing out that these individuals don't seem to be dressed like somebody in the first century. You're right, they're not. In order for people to be able to relate to this, the artist puts them in what is their modern day clothing here. You also can see it here as well. And again, the light draws you to the middle of the painting where all the action is going on, and you even see things like angels and things that draw attention to the supernatural aspect of this as well. So chiaroscuro, a very, very interesting technique. We continue to look at painting in Rome, and we see painters such as Carracci, extreme emotion, realism of detail, an exuberant life, movement, and even a sensuality in this artist's paintings. We see it in works that are in the Galleria of the Palazzo Farnese. The Flight to Egypt is a very good example here. There's ideal proportion. Again, proportion is a new technique that's just been around since the previous era, the Renaissance, where they're trying to put things in the same kind of proportion in which you would see them if you were looking at it in real life. Objects in the background appear smaller because they're further away. But we also see a little retro style here, retroactive to the Greeks and Romans, in the classical order and the realism of the landscape. And we'll show you this same example here in the Flight to Egypt. Of course, this is a biblical scene where Mary and Joseph were told to flee to Egypt with the baby Jesus so that the baby Jesus wouldn't be murdered by Herod's henchmen. Again, you see the classical proportions here, the Greco-Roman style, but the idea that objects are getting smaller as they recede into the background. There's a vanishing point here on the horizon. So all of the things that we've talked about in terms of proportion and perspective are being used in these particular paintings. Now, in the Roman Baroque sculpture and architecture, we see the same characteristics of the Baroque techniques that we've already talked about. One of the greatest sculptors and architects of the era was Bernini. He was the chief architect of the Counter-Reformation, so the Catholic Church used him greatly in this. He would design and have built fountains and palaces and churches. There was a real conflict, however, and rivalry with another great artist of the time named Borromini, and that ends rather tragically. I won't get into that in detail, but all the information, of course, is in your textbook. Obviously, we're talking about religious-themed sculptures, since he's being sponsored by the Catholic Church. Every sculptor, as we've made note in earlier chapters, everybody does a David. That's a very, very popular theme because of the idea of the underdog against the giant there. And another work that he's known for is Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. Here we see the David. Notice there's a huge difference here between previous versions of the David that other sculptors such as Michelangelo and Donatello and so many others have done in the past. This one has such an emphasis on actions and movement and things of this nature. You can really see the motion and the the emotional expression on the face here, the intentness to swing the rock with the sling and hit the giant precisely where it needs to go to kill him. And all the detail in the flowing garment here, these kinds of things. Much different from the previous incarnations of David. Here in the Saint Teresa that we just mentioned, there obviously you've got the angel piercing her heart, and this is said to be in the throngs of ecstasy, religious ecstasy. Though interestingly, there's a sensual element to it. So if you didn't know the story behind it, it might look more like Cupid and young lady falling in love or something like that, but it's different. Again, you see the Baroque technique here of all of the ornateness, the attention to detail in her garment. Amazing to think that somebody sculpted this out of a hard material such as marble, rock, that, that sort of thing. We continue with sculpture rather, and architecture. We mentioned Borromini earlier. He's very brooding, melancholy. Today we would probably call him depressed. There was an obsessive elaboration of design in his works, a highly complex structure in much of his works, and we see that in things such as the Church of San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane and others of his work as well. I recommend that you look at some of the works that are in your chapter and see how he came to his tragic end. We'll now look at France. Switch gears to that in the Académie des Beaux-Arts. One of the great patrons was Louis XIV. You'll recall that somebody has to pay for all of this, and this is how the artists make a living. It's the only people with money, or generally speaking, with big money, is the ruling class, and of course the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. In this case, this is a government official, one of the most famous rulers of all time, Louis XIV. In these particular types of works, you see a defense of traditional standards and of values. So in that way, it tends to be very conservative and very restrained. One of the artists, Georges de Latour, is known for his restrained mood and his repressed emotionality, and so that's why we refer to it as more conservative. A few of the other artists in France that we want to be aware of are individuals like Nicolas Poussin. He protested against the Baroque excesses, all of the ornateness, the fanciness of the artwork, and so there's more of a nostalgic yearning for an idealized past. He yearns for the good old days, so to speak. That's also true of some of the other artists, Claude Gillet and Rigaud. And in Rigaud's portrait of Louis XIV, we really see a good example of this Baroque style, even though it's obviously more restrained than what we saw in Italy. Here he is, Louis XIV. As you can see, a ruler in that day, dressed drastically differently from a ruler would dress today. We'll notice the wig, the makeup, hosiery. Believe it or not, ladies, wigs and hosiery and makeup started with men, even though it's mainly, most often used by women today. And this was said to signify that you had money and that you were royalty. So again, rulers are trying to depict themselves in a royal manner according to what communicates that in the day and age that they live in, rather than the day and age that we live in. You do notice the sword here. It's always advantageous to the ruler if they present themselves as more of a warrior, more so than something else. Continuing with Louis XIV, we see his palace of Versailles. This is one of the most incredible palaces in the world. This is because Louis XIV had the nickname of the Sun King. He was as glorious as the sun. All of these rulers tend to not be very modest. they're always portraying themselves as the great or the lion-hearted or the Sun King. And so this is all about politics and the psychology of politics. They want to present themselves in a very grandiose way with symbolism. And so we see the combination here of these two extremes, one of Baroque extremes and yet contrasted with the other of classical simplicity. And so though those may seem to be contradictory, they're looking for a way to combine them. Great example here of the Renaissance man or the Renaissance person. This is the Palace of Versailles that's still in existence today. This was like a mini kingdom in itself. Believe it or not, this palace could hold up to 50,000 people, if you can believe that. This is somebody fully in control of his destiny. A modern day example of this would be something like on Star Trek when you have Captain Kirk. He's got this powerful ship with a very large crew, and everything they need is on the ship, and it's self-contained and really doesn't need anything else. This is very similar here to the Palace of Versailles. If you look inside, such as a picture like this, you see the Baroque ornateness. That even though they're trying to also combine it with a certain amount of classical simplicity, such as you see up here in these paintings, look at the chandeliers here. Look at the ornate walls, the use of light coming through the various windows. It's an amazing piece of architectural achievement even to this very day. We want to continue now with Baroque art in Spain. In Spain, for reasons that may or may not seem obvious to you, there's a strong religious emotion. Even to this day, the Catholic influence in Latin American countries is very, very strong. So with artists like El Greco, it doesn't surprise us to see these types of religious themes, such as moral responsibility and choice. He borrows from the earlier Mannerist painters, and so brings those tendencies and techniques into play. Jose de Ribera, also very influential here in Spain with his realism, his muscular brutality, and using the chiaroscuro, the contrast of the lights and darks. Velázquez, Diego Velázquez, is the last one we want to mention from the Baroque artist in Spain. We see a real vitality in the way that he presents the scenes. He presents the lives of what he considers to be ordinary people. There's a celebration of the common person. We see that in his works like the Las Meninas, color, space, and the reality of detail. I beg your pardon there. And we see it in this particular work by Velázquez, The Little Women, here. And again, it's supposed to be depicting a scene from ordinary life. But notice here, we see the reflections picked up here in the mirror. And in the back, something you don't see very often, here is the artist himself. He actually depicts himself as a part of the painting reflected over here in the back. And of course you see the genteel little girls here in this middle class family, the dog, and then the little girl up front here who doesn't seem to be real happy about all of the fanciness of the dress and things of this nature. We can only imagine what she might be thinking. But again, the use of light coming here to the middle to accent the lovely little girl here in the white dress, and that use of the contrast of lights, the light and dark to define the shape. Again, that use of chiaroscuro that's so common and was pioneered during this particular era. And as it indicates there, we're going to stop because this is a pretty long chapter, so we're going to break it into two parts. This will be the end of part 1, and we'll pick it up right here next time for part 2.